we're going to be talking about today is formally called Propriety versus Naturalness, but it really is the question of when it's okay to be yourself in life, in society, in personal life. It seems like the type of thing that we should be able to just take for granted, and it should be easy to be yourself all the time. But it also feels like the society that we've built up and that pretty much all of us live in, most of the time it's not okay to be yourself, and maybe that's for the good. I'm not sure. We'll get into that. But the first thing that came to mind for me when I was thinking about this topic is the fact that it could be like split into two categories. There's like the category of, do you even know how to be yourself? Because it can take a while to really get to know yourself. And, I know for me, in the earlier part of my life, I wasn't even, I was so like uptight and anxious that I wasn't even able to be myself. And then later on, when I learned how to be myself, it's like, okay, well, when is this okay? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I want to welcome my guest, Morgan, on. Hi, Morgan.
Hello.
Hi. All right. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about what I just said, or just the general question of like what areas of your life you feel comfortable being yourself in, or if that's even how you think about it.
Well, as you were talking, I had the thought of sort of the very general aspect of when is it okay to be yourself. And I feel like I've heard a lot of people in my life say, if you are with close friends, you can be yourself, or with a partner, you can be yourself. And in public, you don't necessarily act the same way that you would with your friends, or at work you wouldn't necessarily act the same way you would with your friends. And that's sort of the concept that I started from when I was younger, and I think that's a concept that a lot of people are familiar with. But as you were talking, I was struck with that question, when is it okay to be yourself? And I feel like there's some deeper things we could get into about what being yourself actually means, and if that's even the same thing as maybe being a little bit more goofy or relaxed when you're with your friends. So that's just an initial comment that I had from what you said at first. And yeah.
I'm kind of curious what you mean now, because now you got me thinking about all kinds of things, like your background growing up in the South, where I suppose the stereotype is that you would have more of a concept of propriety. What's the proper thing to do? At least that's what you hear is in the culture in the South. So versus where I grew up in New York, this concept of propriety, at least the culture I grew up in, the New York, Long Island Jewish culture, there was just a way of being, and being proper was almost not something that you tried to do. So,
Mhm.
so I'm interested in that, but now I'm focused on the deeper question of what it even means to be yourself that you brought up. So maybe we can go to the cultural differences afterwards. What were you thinking about that? Like, what are the different levels that people might be understanding this concept?
I think that what I have realized about the way that I am in, let's just say, conversations, um, I I tend to think it's easier to err more on the side of propriety in conversations, which is just being cordial, being polite, and um, and maybe not challenging people very much. And I feel like I feel like there's a certain amount of propriety that people should have in day-to-day conversations. And what I'm realizing is that um, my upbringing is what made me feel that way. Um, and then there are some people who I notice like purposefully don't, maybe more like people in New York. Um, some people might try to challenge the aspect of being cordial or being polite, and that's interesting too, but that's not what I'm inclined to do, and it kind of makes me uncomfortable sometimes. Um, and so I think like that's touching on the cultural, but going a level deeper, I've only recently learned that it's not my job to make a conversation great. And I felt like that was a part of myself, was just making it my goal in every conversation that I had to make it great, to make it comfortable for everyone. And that for a really long time, and even still now, feels like part of my actual self. Um, and contrasted with saying something that could be challenging or make someone uncomfortable or something like that. Even if I had those thoughts, I would not say it. And still to this day, sometimes don't always say it. And so I think that's what I'm kind of in the middle of exploring, is who who am I if I'm not trying to make a conversation great all the time? And do I even know who that is?
Wow, that's fascinating. It relates to my comment that I didn't even know who I was at some point, and you've brought
Mhm.
it to the level of it felt natural. It felt like who you really are to have this performative aspect of conversation that made you more comfortable because the other person was really engaged, essentially. You were delivering something for them in terms of the experience of the conversation. At least that's how I'm characterizing it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think certainly like years ago, you would have said, "Well, that is natural. That is me," and it's very interesting that you can evolve, just like I as well have, to uh, to feel like, well, now maybe that both has been and currently is a bit unnatural, and it would be more natural and relaxed to perhaps allow the conversation to falter a little bit, or just see what happens more organically. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Like I feel I enjoy a conversation when it ends up being great. Like using that word as um, as something that has less conflict in it. And so that, yeah, that feels like something that I I enjoy, and it's very me. And conversations that might like kind of deteriorate, like have the happiness or the warmth of them deteriorate in the middle of them, and then get to something deeper, maybe within both people. I typically come away from those types of conversations feeling a little off, or feeling broken, or feeling bad, feeling like maybe something is not right. And so that's just an interesting concept to think about. Um, is that something that should happen or not?
Yeah, I mean, those are strong words that you're using. I'm struck by them. You say, essentially what I hear you describing is that it can feel very unsafe to have a conversation go from being pleasant, the pleasantness of being really engaged with each other, it being higher energy, it being enjoyable, at least some of those things, um, to a place that you're, I believe, admitting in what you said, could be one where there's more growth. Perhaps there's some level of conflict or vulnerability that occurs. So you're knowing that there could be more growth in them, but they what I'm hearing is fundamentally less safe to you.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a little bit of worrying about the other person in there. Does the other person feel safe? Um, and that makes me think of the word propriety and maybe why some of those social norms were established to begin with, like in the South,
Mhm.
is just to make everyone feel safe. Um, and yeah, so I think that I have a hunch that when something makes a person feel unsafe, that is something that's helping them grow almost for sure.
Mhm.
And if it's something that helps someone grow, it's interesting that um, certain norms would be established to try to stop that or
Hmm.
make it happen less.
Right. You can you can understand the intention behind it. It's almost like something that like someone tried to do a good thing and then it kind of went the wrong direction and stayed there and nobody could quite understand why. Um,
Yeah.
I say that because of something that I hear you getting at it, but it's basically that if things are too safe or they're just safe all the time conversationally, then an opportunity is lost because safety is not an area where growth can occur, generally speaking. You stay safe all the time, you will not have the chance, almost like the analogy with like, when you work out, it's like there's small tears in the muscle, something breaks, and that's how it grows. And it seems like that's the same thing that occurs with relationships growing, with knowledge growing inside somebody is ideas that they had before need to be challenged and broken down, and then new ones can spring up or other ones can be affirmed. It's um, but but yeah, that really strikes me as potentially a flaw in being proper too much of the time, which I guess a lot of people would probably agree with. But I'm wondering, since this is a fairly new realization, if how it's gone when you have attempted to change it and have conversations go less perfectly. If you have you?
I have, yeah. And it's it's gone well, which is what's funny. It's funny that it's scary for me still because every time it's happened, it's gone well in that I've grown, which I like to do, but it still does have unsafe feelings during and afterwards. And there's a feeling of, oh, did I do something wrong? Whereas if you have conversations that are perfect or polite, then you walk away feeling like you didn't do anything wrong, in my opinion. Like I feel like most people walk away feeling pretty good about it. Um, and I think the only thing that you are lacking is that growth, I guess, when you walk away. And then this is another thing I was thinking about on the subject of propriety versus naturalness is every person is different. So I think that there's a major part of this subject that is about what are people's goals in life and what are people's goals in a conversation. Um, and there may be some people whose goal is to grow and get closer and get intimately close with people they're talking to. There may be people whose goals are to challenge people, um, but there may be people whose goals are just to walk away from every conversation feeling great. Maybe that's an extreme, but I think that's something I was thinking about as well. But
Hmm.
yeah, just to close the loop on your question, I have tried making conversations a bit uncomfortable or saying something that I know the other person won't agree with. And I walk away feeling uneasy, but feeling a little closer to myself.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I can. make it as simple as this, but right now, as I'm listening to you, it's feeling correct to say that the more comfortable you are with naturalness versus propriety, the more growth you will experience in your life. Not that you shouldn't know when a good time to use propriety is versus naturalness, but I would say if you lean a little bit more heavily on naturalness without being unable to work because you're always so unprofessional, or you can't handle a difficult situation in social communication, a friendship, a community relationship, something like that. But that if you are more geared towards being who you are, more committed to that, you're probably going to have more conflict because people have differences. All people just are going to have differences and tensions between each other. Um, so it feels like that gears you up for a higher growth life, unless it makes you like hermetic or something. Some people can be themselves and then just hang out with like one or two people, and like you know, that's all they want to do. But I guess if you're wanting to interact with a lot of people and be yourself, that's kind of an unusual thing to do, I would almost say.
I think you're right. That's very unusual. I feel like one of the reasons why I hang out with a lot of people, and one of those reasons that I can do that, I think, is because I can um, have some amount of pro- propriety, just to use that word to be the opposite of naturalness.
Mhm.
And I'm also lucky that a lot of the people I hang out with uh, are fairly natural. So it feels like um, if something were to, if I wanted to be more natural, I could safely. Um, but yeah, that way that you phrase that, that if you are, the more comfortable you are with naturalness, the more growth you will have in your life.
Mhm.
And um, I think the complicated part is, yeah, when to use your knowledge of propriety and when to not, and being able to navigate that in all of your conversations, which I would say that I um, am not somebody who is as comfortable with naturalness as I think maybe you are. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But I do think I have the ability to navigate propriety and pick up on when maybe it should be used and maybe when it doesn't need to be used, and I can be a little bit more natural. So that's sort of helped me get to the growth point of where I am now in my life. And then something that I really like that idea that you said, like that I'm kind of inspired now to get more comfortable with naturalness and think of it as something that simple and
Mhm.
not like this scary thing.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I was struck by a comment you almost made as an aside a moment ago. You were like, "So I hang out with a lot of people, and you're generally saying you like it to be a safe experience." And you're like, "But people are accepting." You said something like, "People are accepting when I'm more natural, so it kind of works out." But I
Mhm.
almost don't feel like that can be true. It can happen. There can be people that are more likely to be comfortable with you being natural, people that you're more naturally a fit with, which are probably many of your friends.
Mhm.
Um, but I feel like if you slip into being too much yourself, and I don't mean like totally inappropriately so,
Mhm.
like there's a level of just basic courtesy to human beings you're hanging out with socially. Um, I do feel like it naturally brings up differences, whatever differences there are, if you do it long enough. And again, like I'm saying, you could spend time with somebody that really vibes well with who you are, and that's just not going to be a thing as much. But yeah, I almost think it would be very tough for people to accept who you are a very high percentage of the time if you're being like really natural, a large percentage of the time, especially across many different people. So perhaps you could get away with doing it with one or two people that are like really close to you and you're together because a lot of your ideologies, your ways of being are very similar. But if you try doing that even with like 5 people, and let's say you're yourself 80% of the time, forgive me for being someone interested in quantifying so much. um, I feel like that endangers you, and um, and I think it's good, but feels unsafe. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I agree with you that if I really thought about it, for most people, you're probably gonna have something that rubs somebody else the wrong way within a group of 5 people.
Mhm.
Um, so I think you are right about that, and um, and that's just interesting. It's interesting to think about. Um,
Yeah. This is a small tangent, but on the same subject. What you said before made me think about it. Is I have been in, I would say, not a concerted effort, but I've just felt like it's the right sort of natural direction for me to be more myself than I've ever been lately. And it has been uncomfortable. And it's interesting how much it interacts with parts of you, just like everything is like you bring certain stuff, your stuff to the conversation, whatever it is, your past, the cultural elements that are integrated into your mind, what you feel like in the moment, physical feelings you have in the moment, all these things. But I feel like if I am very natural and somebody says something, I'm like, I feel differently, even though I come to it, if it's someone I'm close to, I come to it with love. It still feels uncomfortable for the other person and for me, and I know that, like, it feels more dangerous for me because I don't like conflict. Like, I want to get along, and I'm getting that you are the same, and in that sense.
yeah.
But I know my experience, and it sounds like you're doing this a little bit more too, but I'm not sure how similar it is to the way I'm doing it, but I am finding it's uncomfortable to be more myself. And so far it's worth it. But sometimes I'm like, this is not worth it because I just want to have a pleasant day and be safe, you know? So I can't tell what I'm saying right now, other than I'm not going to stop doing what I'm doing because I feel like it deepens friendships to do that. But you
Mhm.
deepen the friendship at the risk of almost feeling like you could lose it, because there's just an inherent threat somewhere in the back of your mind that if you're too much yourself, you could lose the other person.
I think I relate to that, and I think you're right that um, it's like I think of the concept, whether this is true or not. I think of the concept of a friend as somebody you can relax with,
Mhm.
and if you have conflict with a friend enough times, then it's hard to relax around
If you're like always
them.
fighting, yeah.
Yeah, you're just like, oh, I don't want to see this person. I'm gonna not be relaxed. What's the point of that?
Right.
And so I think that that's maybe part of the whole discussion is yeah, when is there too much growth in a series of months, or um, how much growth is each person willing to do, how much energy does each person have, um, how much does the other person feel like they need the other person um, in order to fight or work for that friendship. These are all things that are just coming up in my head. Um, and yeah, I'm just off of your thought of, I don't want to fully be myself because I want to have a pleasant day.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I think that um, this is reminding me of a story of my mom's grandparents. I think it might have been her aunt and uncle, but it was an older couple in her life when she was a girl. and they had completely different political views, and they were married. And when it came to be around election time, they would argue and just fight all the time, yelling at each other. And then they would vote. And then the next day they would be totally in love, never talk about it again for 4 years. And they were just two people that lived in this house together and had like completely different views, but found a way for it to not affect their marriage in a way that bothered them. And I think they both just felt good about canceling each other out. And then they weren't so political that it affected their everyday life. And I just find that really interesting. And I think there are some friendships where you know that you disagree on something, and you decide not to talk about something, or you decide the frequency that you're going to talk about it. And I think there can actually be some safety in that, and that's sort of a moment of propriety where you're deciding not to talk about it today. Yeah.
You bring up so many interesting things. I'm like having to remember all of them. So you just made a statement that in a friendship, you can decide not to bring up things, or the frequency. And I'm not sure if one was replacing the other, but it really struck me that there's a gigantic difference between those two things. And I don't know if you, if you were to mean never bring up difficult things, at least for me, I find it like that's not a very good friendship. However, the frequency thing is just a fascinating question in and of itself. You can have too much conflict, obviously, but to get the temperature, nobody ever says this, and nobody ever like articulates the concept out loud in a friendship. Like, how much conflict? Am I okay with conflict like 5% of the time? 2%? It's probably not much more than that. 10 is like the max percentage I can imagine. Quantifying again. But nobody discusses it, but it's a very good question. It almost would be one of those like core questions of you're going to see people's compatibility as friends or relationship partners, whatever, to know that, because it seems like the couple in your story were okay with heated conflict every 4 years for, I don't know, a month or two, or however long the intensity of the election was taking place in their household. But that is something that is rarely agreed upon, but is very important. And I do think for many relationships, the answer is like almost none is acceptable. Like it's bad to have even any conflict. And that I would say is unhealthy.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that I think some of the first friendships I've had that have both parties okay with a little bit of conflict are here in the Bay Area, and there's actually a surprising amount of friendships that I have that are like that. But yeah, all friendships before that, it was almost no conflict, and there was some, but it was not talked about. It just sort of happened, and then it was over, and then we were still friends. And so I was saying frequency to replace never talking about things. I think that there are definitely some relationships like that, but they probably don't last very long. And then there also are some relationships where, I think people decide on a frequency, whether it's a discussion or whether it's unspoken. And I think that could be a certain level of healthy. And one of the reasons I think that is I think having enough experiences with that friend in between the conflicting experiences can remind you of why you want to fight for the friendship or work hard
Hmm.
um, to have vulnerability and communicate in the friendship. And I think that I personally need that. Like I think I need um, like some space from the conflicts in order to have energy in the friendship.
So you mean you don't like conflict all the time in your friendships?
Not every hangout, every moment of every hangout. No.
I don't understand that. It's crazy, but okay. Um, yeah, that makes sense. But you're saying like, you need your balance is, I don't know exactly what it is, but there needs to be plenty of the enjoyable stuff because that's part of what makes the friendship worthwhile. It improves the quality of your life, your day. I mean, I think that's the reason.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And that's not to say that I wouldn't be willing to go through a hard time. Like I know that can sometimes happen in marriages where you just have a rough year.
Mm,
And even if there are little moments of happiness within that year, there is still like with somebody that you're romantically involved with, um, there's more at stake when you're going through a rough time. Like there's the question of intimacy and physical touch and all of that, which is sort of hard to do. There's a big thing in your mind that you disagree on or that you feel conflicted on. But in a friendship, it's a little bit more like getting dinner or hangouts and things like that, which I think can be easier to do when there's a conflict on both of the friends' minds.
mhm.
I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing
Yeah,
off of that.
I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm like wondering, thinking about the difference between a romantic partner and like a friend. And there's many different types of friends and levels of closeness as well. But it's like we all need certain experiences, social experiences in our lives. And I'd say if you look at the pie of social experiences, that includes your intimate partner, includes all of your friends and even community and stuff. There's some people, friends, whose almost job it is in your life is to provide escape, laughter, pleasantness. There may be some friends within that pie of experiences that provide more growth. And then usually an intimate partner, I think this is right, but I could be wrong here, is one in which you can have some conflict and growth. Although I've learned not to assume things about people's intimate relationships because some people do things super different than I do,
Mm.
and they're compatible. Just like I'm compatible with my wife, but in a way that like wouldn't work for me. So, but yeah, maybe there are some relationships where you don't really have much conflict at all, and all the growth through conflict or tension or of differences or whatever occurs in friendships, occurs in community life. I suppose that's an option, but it's not one that I've experienced or thought about as much, just as a proportion of growth to pleasantness or whatever. I was also intrigued by you talking about earlier friendships and then the Bay Area. And, I know you've been in the Bay Area 5 years. Is that what it is?
7, yeah,
Oh, 7 years.
I
Okay.
think,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I almost wonder if there's an age and maturity thing to it. Like, do we think there's a
Mm.
lot of high schoolers that are capable and able and like it's part of the world of somebody that's, 15, 16, whatever, to be able to safely have conflict? Or is it too much of an insecure time?
I certainly wasn't able to have conflict in high school, but I do think that there were definitely people who had conflict and continued to be friends afterwards. And maybe that happened a little bit to me too. So there was conflict, as there always is in relationships, but I think in high school, the conflicts, at least in my high school and my friend group, were a little bit simpler
Hmm.
or a little bit less communicated about. So
Hmm.
like one day you're in a fight, one day you're not,
Hmm.
which is not the type of naturalness and conflict that we're talking about in terms of our lives at this age.
Right.
Um, yeah, I don't know. What do you think about high schoolers?
Well, my feeling is that high schoolers, while it is a more naive time of life, are getting more sophisticated and comfortable with speaking openly. It used to be kind of forbidden for men to talk openly about feelings and negotiate some of the tougher social emotional issues between people. But I see that more and more.
Hmm.
Um, just experiences with people that have kids that are in high school and stuff like that. So I have a lot of hope that there's more of that happening. But what I think happens more often when you're younger, and you sort of hinted at this, is that conflict occurs because people can't help it. Someone just has a moment of being natural and saying what's on their mind, or just letting their emotions, kind of take over, and then they just get passionate and say something. It causes conflict. You don't particularly talk about it, or maybe you have one conversation that is much more an outpouring of emotion than it is like a negotiating of like, no, but I actually do feel this way on a deep level. It's more just like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I care so much about you. And that, even though that's nice, it does sweep some things under the rug. And
Hmm.
then you can grow stronger from it, or it can break up an early friendship. Um, but it's not because you've actually worked out the tough issues. It's because there's enough there that's naturally bonding you together that the friendship grows, because it has built in a tolerance for a little bit of conflict, and maybe more of an appreciation for the different aspects of that person. So it almost is like a less clear and communicative way of doing it. And I would say probably the most common way of doing it, but not as mature and ultimately good, as being able to reason out and tease out all the little bits of the conflict, the different deep feelings and ideologies at play. I think there's a lot of value in putting everything on the table, but I don't see it happen very much.
That sounds right. And I am struck by the idea of putting everything out on the table, which I also like. And I realize that every person is different with that too.
Mhm.
Um, I think that there are some people that might experience a conflict differently. So, like something could happen to with me and my friend, and it could touch more on things inside me than it touches on things inside her. And so I could feel more hurt by it, and more like bringing more things to the table. And she could feel like, oh, I did this wrong. I still feel this way. I did this right. I'm listening, but I'm not as phased by this now that we're talking about it. But I'm like, oh, there's so much more to talk about. And so that's interesting to me, just how two people can experience things differently.
Hmm.
And if both if one friend isn't willing to dive deeper with the other one, then I think that is a moment where I might feel like, okay, maybe I'll have more propriety here
Hmm.
because I want to protect this friendship.
Yeah.
So that's something that just came to my mind as you were talking about high school relationships, even though it's about my current state.
Yeah. Well, it's about people's tolerance for going deeper, putting it all out there,
Hmm.
um, which I think is a very important subject. And I don't hear anything wrong with what you're saying, that you would go to propriety in those moments, because what I'm getting from the hypothetical friend there is that they wouldn't be able to handle putting it on the table. I mean, that's kind of what you said. So I would almost just call that like you using your social intelligence to say, I'm not going to make somebody feel bad and kind of feel confused because they are not going to go there. They aren't thinking as deeply. They're not committed to it. They're not interested in it, whatever the reason may be. So I feel like you don't have many choices there unless you want to alienate your friend. Um, there's a difference, a very important, almost like structural difference between you and this theoretical friend, where they're not wanting to go and put things out on the table emotionally. And that's not just, oh yeah, okay, no problem. Let's just keep it lighter. I'm sure that's the way like you would do it, but and it might come across that way, but isn't there some degree of emotional work involved? Isn't there a little burden when you know that there's stuff out there and it's not just your stuff, it's really between you and the other person, and they can't talk about it, or you know they don't really want to talk about it, then you have to think about that on your own. I mean, maybe you bring it to your partner or something, but when you can't say something to somebody, I think it produces a burden.
That's interesting that you say it produces a burden because you might be right. And the way that I have thought of it my whole life is that is the way it is. Like I do that emotional work because I'm me, and that's how I am.
Mhm.
And that's what life is doing emotional work for people. Uh, that's legitimately how I feel.
Uh-huh.
Honestly, how I completely felt before I met you. And then there was this concept of like, oh, you don't have to do emotional work for people? What? What? So,
Yeah, well, you do to some degree, but it's certainly worth thinking about. I mean, because I relate to you, not in the social, well, no, no, it sort of is in the social realm, but not necessarily in the friendship realm, but like in intimate relationships. My whole life, I've always been like someone that's like, I'll put forth a ton of work for you. Essentially, I will be thoughtful and get gifts and remember the right, the occasions and celebrate them correctly. And it's like I'm kind of like an overachiever. And I know that I've changed a lot recently, like since, well, in the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, as I've realized that. And like, that's not even good for the other person if I don't mean it every time. If I'm just putting in the
mm,
work because I'm used to that, I think it's less meaningful than if I really have to decide, oh, that is work and I may or may not feel like to do it. And maybe I want to put forth the extra work to do it for my partner. But other times I should not do it because it makes me less available and energetic in other parts of my life if I'm always doing emotional work. So I do relate to you in what looks like a slightly different realm, I think at least. But yeah, it's worth questioning to me. Um, yeah, is that how you feel about it? Or?
I think I think you make a good point when you say I don't uh, think it's good if I don't always mean it, and
Mhm.
the um, the taking away energy from other parts of your life. I think um, that's what's worth, especially the part that's worth exploring to me is how often do I mean it, and how
Mm.
often does it happen out of love? And I do think that um, it when it's not happening out of love and when it is a burden is a good time to explore why it's happening.
And if you don't mind, I'll press you a little further. Why? Because I agree with you, but I want to hear your reasons why.
Why is it worth exploring?
Why is it worth exploring and not, you're not willing to just reflexively spend the energy at this point? Or at least that's how you're thinking about it now.
Um, I guess I should say I'm not totally sure if I'm there yet. Like I'm still reflexively spending the energy,
Hmm.
and I'm a little bit worried about what will happen um if I explore it with the other person or stop spending the emotional energy when I don't mean it, or when it's not out of love. But the reason I think it's worth exploring when I'm in a place where I'm not worried about it is so that it doesn't have to happen in a way where um, I'm more tired than I need to be, or so that the other person can know the amount of emotional work that I'm doing. Like I know that when friends have told me that they've done emotional work for me, and
Mhm.
I had no idea. I remember being really happy that I knew that. It's sort of like knowledge is power. So yeah, it's easy for some people, I think, to tell um, their friends when they're doing too much emotional work for them, and for me, it's not easy.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah.
I see and sympathize with that because it does seem like something that has, I don't know if it'd be going too far to say been a survival method but it's certainly been a thriving method for you, to be able to be adept in conversation and sort of provide a good experience in conversation, support people if they're not able to put things on the table, to be okay with that and go to the level that's right for them. I'm vibing with what you're saying about your energy being higher. And I also think of another analogy. This is bring up an analogy for me, which is that I made a pact with myself that I'm still very happy about to this day, that whenever my wife shows me an outfit or a piece of clothing she's thinking about buying, or an outfit that she has and saying, oh, how does this look? That I'm always honest. So I never say, oh
Mhm.
my God, perfect, unless I'm just like struck immediately. I
Mhm.
always stop and think about it and then say what's honest. It's very inconvenient. Sometimes we're like 10 minutes late and it's really not the time to be like, I don't think that that blouse goes with those jeans. I'm sorry. And sometimes she's like, you have no idea what you're talking about. You're right. But I say it just so that she and I can both be clear that I have credibility, that I'm being honest.
Mhm.
And when I say, wow, you look amazing, she knows I mean it and she could take the full strength of the compliment and enjoy it. So that's an analogy I feel like bringing into this conversation about what you're expressing about your relationships, is to know that when you do expend energy, etc., it's purely out of love, and that when you say something or act a certain way, that it's really meant, probably has a certain has just a wonderful value. Um, so I don't know if I'm twisting what you're saying at all, but
No, I think you're on the nose. And to go back to safety, I
mhm,
think it provides the most safety for the friend to know that um, when I'm doing emotional work or whatever, it's coming from a place of love, and
mhm,
it should make them feel safe, that it's honest, and um, it's something I want to do. And I think I feel a little bit self-conscious about if if somebody is doing emotional work for me and they don't want to. And so I think the situation would be the same reversed. I would like to feel safe that my friends are doing emotional work for me when I need it, when they want to, so that I can just be in my sadness, or be comforted by them, and not think in the back of my mind that something else might be going on in their mind. And I think that is sort of the essence of the flaws of propriety, and you see it in movies about the South, or um, societies with like high high like standards of propriety, that there's a lot of talking behind people's backs, and a lot of shiny perfection on the surface, but the opposite down below or in private. And so I think that's interesting that we got all the way back around to that.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how so many shows that are based in like, England, um, that's often like the main thing that is that where the intrigue is in the show, is the concept of people saying one thing and meaning the other, and just within the social milieu and the dialogue, that's where all the scandal and intrigue and stuff is. And I think it's fairly easy to take place in like, the UK or someplace like that, because that is a cultural norm. So it has that in common with the American South, I would say. Variety matters a lot. And I think a lot of cultures have that. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I just want to mention one anecdotal story that relates to this, which is my fiance and I had a photo shoot yesterday, and the night before we completely cleaned our home and put away everything that was messy, and put everything in the closet basically. And so everything was styled and looked perfect when the photographer came in.
Hmm.
And we chose this photographer because he was very artistic. He's also a filmmaker. Um, and from his website we could tell that he was really good at capturing like what was real. And the first thing he said when he walked in was like, okay, well, what do you guys usually have on this table? Like, can we get some coffee? Can we get some stuff? Like, what do you usually have here? And we spent the whole photo shoot like running around pulling everything back out from the closet and putting it on the table. And
Oh,
of course it was a little bit more curated, but I just think that's such a funny metaphor for what we're talking about.
that's so perfect. Wow, I love that. Yeah, you made it so proper that you kind of lost you guys,
Mhm.
and this really bright wedding photographer obviously got that. Like, no, it needs the signs of the connection between you guys, who you are. I mean, it's true. I feel like those photographs are going to mean more to be like, oh my God, that's that clue game that we played all the time that year that we were engaged, whatever. Um,
Yeah.
so interesting. Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll just kind of conclude with this thought, and if you want to respond, feel free, is that I'm struck by all the different layers and almost messiness of communication and relationships. And
Mhm.
I feel like every year or period of years, 5 years or so in my life, I have learned more and more to be more accepting of the different ways that people relate. And then to actually be able to tell the difference between just differences and things that are like universally more healthy. Like some degree of communication, I think, is universally more healthy, even though some people just naturally are very complementary to each other and prefer less communication. That's an agreement between them, and that
Mhm.
works for them. But as long as the communication, even if it's nonverbal, is there to some degree, I feel like that's a universal thing. But when it comes to the wide social world of your community and your friendships and stuff, the more of them there are, the more different ways you're going to have to handle, conflict percentages with friends, like how much you can have, how much you want to have, which friends are good for what. Like, it's a lot to hold in your mind as you're also evolving and being a slightly different person each year of your life, and how that changes your relationship with that person who's also evolving. So I'm just kind of struck by, wow, that's a lot of stuff that us human beings have to keep in our minds, as social beings.
Yeah, I think that's just interesting to sit with, and I'm going to sit with that even after this conversation. But the main thing that struck me was just the messiness of it all. And um I've never necessarily thought of a mess as being really a bad thing. So I like that.
Mhm.
I'm a supporter of the messiness of the communication and the conflict, even if it makes me uncomfortable sometimes.
And as an overly neat person, I love that. And I'm going to walk away from this conversation and think about a mess is not a bad thing. Like, whoa.
Great.